Chapter 1 of Murder Mistress by Robert Colby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 1. At 10 o'clock that night, Scott Daniels estimated that he was about 2 hours out of Miami. He had been driving south since dawn with only the dashboard radio for company. In the afternoon, the heat of a merciless July hot spell had begun to wear him down, so that the landscape fused and shimmered, and the hours of road jog made him feel strangely unbalanced and lightheaded. He had spun across the middle of the state over Route 27 because the towns were fewer and smaller, and he could make better time. Also, there were long stretches of open road such as the one he was traveling now. Nothing for endless miles, but the flat tangle of the Everglades. He had stopped only once to eat, grabbing a quick sandwich while the car was being gassed and checked. His haste was not of necessity. He had another 6 days of vacation, and tomorrow would be just a span of idleness with depressing reflections over his failure in New York. But Myra waited in the stuffy little West Side apartment, and while Myra waited, he wasn't going to spend another night on the road. Because as his whole bright and hectic success had come tumbling down in a fraction of the time it took to build it, Myra had stood on the sidelines with a certain sadness in her smile, but without the least accusation in her eyes. And above all in the world that was left to him, he loved Myra most. So that the urgency which pushed him forward into the night against hunger, against bone weariness, was self-induced. A half-hour earlier, the heat had reached a seemingly inevitable climax in one of those massive broken dam thunder showers for which Florida is famous. The rain had come smashing out of the sky as though driven by a minor hurricane. Visibility had been not much better than a car length ahead. The road was practically awash, and Daniels had lost the better part of 20 minutes before abruptly it ended. Now the highway glistened under the long cone of his headlights. The air which rushed past his window was only slightly cooler, and there was a soggy smell and feel to it. Yet, in one sense, Daniels was revived and eager. It was a mere spurt to Miami. He hadn't seen a half-dozen cars in the last 40 minutes, not a single habitation. A lone gas station had been closed, but just ahead there was an intersection where he knew the highway picked up a branch that curved left toward the east coast. He released the accelerator even as he saw the lights of a combined gas station and cafe. It was a long and shoddy wood-frame building. White and faded blue neon alternated, weakly blinking. Eats. Gas. Eats. Gas. He needed gas. And also food. The place stood squarely to the right of the intersection and had the quality of a bleak outpost in the night. There were 2 pumps which sat center of an unpaved island. He wheeled his '56 Ford into position beside them and waited. When no one came, he didn't blow his horn but cut the motor and lights, took the keys, and went inside. There was a rectangle of dusky room lighted by a trio of low-watt naked bulbs, suspended from ceiling cords. To one side was a scattering of scarred tables and chairs, while opposite these were a bar over which, tacked to a wall, was a hand-painted sign. Beer and wine. Next to a door which apparently led to a kitchen was a square serving window. The one touch of color in the room was an immense red-trimmed jukebox. The place had a musty wood smell, seasoned with motor oil. A paunchy man, in a stained white shirt, sleeves rolled above his biceps, leaned heavily upon the bar. He peered myopically at a crumpled newspaper as he rolled a toothpick from side to side in his mouth. If he heard Daniels, he didn't look up at his entrance. The only other occupant of the room was an unusually attractive girl somewhere in her mid-20s. She had dark hair which fell softly to a point just above her shoulders. Her delicately molded features were made up with that mixture of accent and restraint which come only with natural instinct for artful grooming. Even sitting at the bar, her long legs and the slender sweep of her waist spoke of tallness. Her white skirt seemed immaculate. She wore a pale green blouse. It was plain, short-sleeved, open at the throat, and had the look of expensive silk. Strapped over her shoulder was a handsomely tooled alligator bag. Though her attire was casual, the total effect of her made her surroundings seem the more shabby. As Daniels entered, she was already turned to face him, easing off the stool and peering at him intently, expectantly. He paused in the doorway, a little caught by the unexpected sight of such beauty, apparently intent upon his arrival. Now she came towards him a step, but then as he moved and fell under the light, something went out of her face, and she turned away immediately, remounting the stool and giving her undivided attention to the coffee in her cup. The paunchy man looked up at last and said, "Something for you, mister?" "Gas," said Daniels, "if that's in your department." "What's that?" "I said fill her up with regular." "Yeah, sure thing," said the man, folding the paper and shoving it aside. "You want regular, don't you?" "What have you got to eat?" said Daniels, sighing and approaching the bar. "Kitchen's closed." Daniels frowned. "That's bad news," he said. He studied the man. "I guess it is, anyway." "What's that?" Daniels sat down but didn't answer. "Got some crackers, if you're hard put. Peanut butter or cheese?" "Cheese," said Daniels, "and a beer to wash it down." "What brand you like?" Just so it's cold." The girl got off her stool and went to the open doorway, peering out. There was tension in her every movement. "Hell of a bad rain a while ago," said the barkeep. "Goddamn skies busted wide open and fell right on top of us. You get caught in it." "In the middle," said Daniels absently, turning slowly to watch the girl who was still gazing out the door and pulling nervously on the strap of her bag. Nice, he thought. A sweet bundle. And right out in this wilderness, in this gas and eats joint. There was a time before Myra when he would have made much of such an event. At 32 he was lean and darkly handsome, but 2 hours away, restless in the heat, Myra would be waiting, listening for the sound of him at the door, running to comfort him, to hear him out with tender patience. No, even if this one were willing, there was nothing in him for the old game. The barkeep set the beer in front of him with the crackers. "Now I'll go out and gas you up," he said. "Check under the hood." "Just the gas," said Daniels, "and the windshield." At the doorway the girl gave way for the man, and after a final look into the darkness went to the jukebox and made much of selecting a number. The music blared too loudly, too jarringly in the silence of the narrow room. Still watching the machine, the girl tapped her foot, but it seemed more like a release of pressure than any real pretension of keeping time. In a minute she came back to her stool. Tasting the cold coffee, she made a face and pushed the cup away. At that moment she turned and their eyes met. He smiled pleasantly, but without the least overtone of meaning. She smiled back. She glanced at her watch. Then out the door. "Must be a guy," thought Daniels. "And I wish he'd come. I get nervous just watching her." The record died. There was a rumble and the sigh of air brakes. A big trailer truck rolled to a stop on the other side of the pumps. The girl swung to the sound, startled. More on edge than ever, she clamped teeth on lower lip and began to drum the bar surface with the pink petals of her nails. Her fingers paused, then spread out rigidly. Decision reached her face. She turned to Daniels with a set expression. "Which way are you headed?" she said quickly. "Miami," replied Daniels. "On 27? "That's right." "I wondered then if you would be willing to take me along. I seem to be stuck here." She didn't smile, offered none of the feminine charms of her persuasion. "Someone was supposed to meet you," said Daniels, "but didn't show. Is that it?" "That's it. And, of course, I have no way to get in touch. There was a very definite arrangement, and I'm worried. I must get to Miami." "Well," said Daniels, who liked to understand the logic of a situation, "there was a storm. There are all sorts of mechanical troubles which could crop up, and your friend may have been delayed. How long have you been waiting?" She looked at her watch. "Exactly 22 minutes. 22 minutes? Well, excuse me, but I really don't think you've waited long enough. People can be that late meeting you on a street corner." She shook her head positively. "No, I'm afraid you don't understand, and I don't particularly care to explain, if you don't mind." "Certainly," said Daniels. It was better not to pursue it. She seemed intelligent enough to know what she was doing. He sipped his beer. "Can we get going?" she said. "I mean, are you ready?" He looked at her, slightly annoyed, but he held the remark he was about to make. There wasn't room in her face to crowd another line of disturbance. She would come apart. He gulped his beer and stood. "I'm ready," he said. "As a matter of fact, I'm in almost as much hurry as you are." Together, they went out to the car. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Murder Mistress by Robert Colby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 2. She sat almost on the edge of the seat, leaning forward slightly. Supporting herself with one hand on the dash, she peered ahead into the night. They had gone perhaps 3 miles with the speedometer hovering at 60. The highway had dried considerably, and only the hiss of the tires spoke of its wetness. "Tell me," he said, "just as a point of curiosity, how did you arrive way out here in the first place?" She withdrew her attention from the road with great effort and looked at him briefly. "I was brought here," she said. "By car, of course. And then the gentleman had to go alone on an errand. It wasn't supposed to take much over a minute or two, but he didn't come back." "I see," said Daniels. "How very odd." He could understand a little better now, though where the gentleman would go, and on what errand in an area of the Everglades where there was nothing for miles in any direction but the gas station cafe, he couldn't imagine. "I'm Scott Daniels. I never did get your name." "Valerie," she said absently, looking straight ahead and speaking the word from the far distance of detachment. "Valerie?" he said. "Yes, just Valerie." They lapsed into silence. In a minute or two, he became aware that he was quickly gaining on some vehicle. Far ahead, he could see the red jog of a taillight. The light seemed oversized and strangely misplaced. It should be directly in line of his vision on the unbending road, but no, it appeared to wink on and off to the left. Then he picked up another blinking red eye, also to the left. In a few seconds, it was clear. They were not taillights, but signal flashers on the left side of the road. And now he could see other lights, headlights, oddly canted. It added up to an accident with police and the usual curious travelers pausing for the thrill. He had a startling thought and looked quickly at the girl. She had seen it. She leaned forward with her face almost to the windshield. She was rigidly intent. Both hands were riveted to the dash. "Keep calm," he said. "It could be someone else, you know. In any case, perhaps no one was hurt. You want me to stop, don't you?" She nodded tightly without turning. "But not too close," she said in a thin, dry voice. "Please, not too close. Stop on this side. Then you go and come back and tell me." "Okay. Until then, just don't anticipate. It's going to be all right." But he didn't really believe it was going to be all right. There was a side road which angled to the left. Down this road were a half-dozen cars which must have pulled off the highway to avoid the narrow shoulder. And now the red flashing of patrol cars was clearly visible, and below them a small cluster of people gathered around the shadowy outlines of 2 automobiles which had careened off the highway into a shallow gully. The cars were separated by some 25 yards, and one of them had keeled over. He took the side road, parked, and said, "Now, who am I looking for?" "Never mind," she answered. "Never mind." Her voice was on the edge of hysteria. "Just see if one of the cars is a light blue convertible with a Florida tag. It's a new Cadillac with a dark blue top. Tell me what happened to the man in it. Hurry, please, run!" On the highway above the wreck, there were 2 patrol cars. An officer sat inside one of the cars and wrote something under the glow of a dome light. He paused to speak into a microphone. There was a crackling, followed by a muted reply in a heavy male voice. Daniels looked below. A cream and red Olds sedan lay on its side like some great beast felled in a jungle. Most of the small crowd swarmed around it. A few others inspected the second car, which stood upright a good 75 feet away. It was in shadow, and the color was not distinguishable, but it appeared to be a Cadillac convertible. Daniel stepped around to the officer's window. "Anyone hurt, officer?" he asked. The officer gave him a hasty glance and continued writing on a sheet of paper fastened to a clipboard. "Yeah," he said. "1 man hurt, so far." "You don't happen to have his name there, do you?" The officer looked up at him more carefully, then down to the sheet of paper, squinting. "Name of Martin Bates," he said. "Mean anything to you?" "No," said Daniels. "Was he in the Olds?" "Yup." "Bad?" "Don't know till we checked the hospital. Ambulance took him away. Looks like he pulled through." "Who was in the convertible?" "Don't know," said the officer. He pushed his cap back and sighed. "Now, do me a favor and let me get this report out, will you?" "Sorry," said Daniels, "and thanks a lot." He moved down into the gully and, after a brief look at the Olds, hiked down to the Cadillac. It was a late model convertible, pale blue with a dark blue top. It had Florida tags. The right front was badly mauled. Tree branches and leaves were embedded in the broken grille. The right rear fender was gouged, the rear bumper half torn from the body. There was no other visible damage. A pair of teenage boys and a young couple leaned inside the open windows, remarking on the magnificence of the automobile. The interior was clean and there was the smell of new leather. Daniels trotted up to the road and back to his car. She was outside, standing in the darkness.
"Tell me," she said breathlessly. "A blue Cadillac?"
"Yes, but I don't think whoever was in it was hurt. Guy hurt was in the Olds. You know anyone by the name of Martin Bates?" She let out a long breath.
"No," she said. "But what about the Cadillac?"
"The officer I talked to didn't know who was in it. No sign of him. The other man was taken to the hospital. This, Bates." She was silent, breathing deeply. "I looked at the damage to the Cadillac," said Daniels. "You don't have to worry. If your friend was hurt, it wasn't serious. The inside is neat as a pin."
"What about the rear?" she said. "Was there any damage to the trunk?"
"No," he said. "Why?" It seemed a curious question under the circumstances.
"Were the keys in the switch?"
"No, I noticed they were gone."
"I have a bag in that trunk," she said. "I want that bag. I have to get it. There's some things in it that would identify me. I mean, I can't be associated with this man. He's married, and there could be a scandal."
"I've got the picture," said Daniels, not terribly surprised. "If your friend has disappeared and they tow the car in, then—"
"Exactly," she said. "So, will you help me get that suitcase?"
"I don't see how," said Daniels. "I'd like to be gallant and all that, but the trunk looked very much locked to me." She fumbled in her purse and handed him a set of keys. He took them reluctantly.
"It's the round key," she said. "The square one is for the ignition."
"It's your car?"
"Well, no, but I used it a lot, and I have my own keys."
"Great. With cops and people all over the place, I walk up and open the trunk. Don't you think somebody's going to ask questions, especially since they must be looking for this guy?"
"Of course," she said, "it's possible that he took the bag with him, but just in case, would you?"
"Sorry," he said. "My hospitality has certain limits. If I was seen, it would be messy. I make enough trouble for myself without asking for it."
"I wouldn't want you to risk it for nothing," she said. "It would be worth, say, $100 to me."
$100? My God, listen, if I knew you better, I might chance it for nothing. And then again, I might not.
"I see," she said. "With men, it always gets back to that."
"You're wrong there, Valerie. I didn't mean that at all. My wife and I have it good together, and she's waiting at home for me right now. I meant if I understood the situation well enough to know what I might get into."
"That's impossible," she said. "But I'll make it 500.
"You have that kind of money?"
"Yes."
There was a time when he could walk away from 500 without batting an eye if it pleased him. But now it would be exactly 5 weeks' pay, forgetting taxes. "I could use it," he said, "but I wouldn't take that much from you."
"Don't be foolish," she said. "It wouldn't mean a thing to me. I can afford it."
"Cash?"
"Cash. On delivery."
"No advance?"
"No advance."
"All right. Is there just the one bag?"
"Just one. A tan suitcase. Quite big, but not heavy."
"Wait here," he said. "I'll at least give it a try." Up on the road, a wrecker had arrived. Presently, the crew were working at righting the Olds. The activity had drawn the attention of the crowd, but 2 men in coveralls were examining the Cadillac. A bald, beefy man lifted the hood. "Wonder if she'll start," he said. "Looks okay." "Things like this you never can tell," said the other. "No keys in it, anyway. Police must have taken them. Wonder who owns it. Rich son of a bitch." $6,000-7,000 worth of stuff in here," said the beefy one. "At least there was." He closed the hood and both men walked around the car. They seemed in no hurry to leave, but now the Olds had been hoisted back on its 4 wheels and the crowd was gaping inside. It gave Daniels an idea. He made his voice excited. "Say," he said to the men, "looks like they might have found someone else in that Olds, where they're gathered around." "Yeah," said the bald one incredulously. "Come on, Charlie. Let's have a look." They departed at a brisk walk. The round key was already between thumb and forefinger. Quickly, he bent over the rear deck and turned it in the lock. The lid gave, and he pulled it up. Spare tire, tools, a tan case. He grabbed it. It was somewhat heavier than she had led him to believe. he swung it out and closed the lid. He began to walk away with it, planning to cut through the trees and brush, taking shortcut and concealment. But just as he came around to the front of the car, the beam of a light caught him from behind. He turned. Flash in hand, an officer was moving toward him on an oblique path from the highway. Fortunately, he was separated from the officer by the hood of the car, and only his back was visible. Without bending, he let the bag drop from his hand. He kicked it flat, then gave it a frantic shove so that it was partly hidden under the car. He continued on around the convertible, employing a casual attitude of inspection. The officer came up to him. He wore sergeant's stripes. "We've been looking for you, mister," he said. "For me? Your car, ain't it?" "No, sir, not mine." "Then what were you doing with your head in that trunk?" "Oh, see what you mean." His mind raced. "Well, I just gave the handle a pull and the lid came up, so I had a look." The sergeant flashed his light over the ground in the area of the convertible. He barely missed the corner of the suitcase extending near the right front wheel. "I could swear you took something out of that trunk," he said. "Guess you better come along with me, fella. I think this is your wagon." "I own a '56 Ford parked over on that side of the road," said Daniels. He fumbled for his wallet and removed the registration. "Here," he said. "This proves it." The sergeant studied the paper under the flash. He handed it back. "Guess you're okay," he said. "But whoever owns this baby did a quick fade. Mighty quick. Because 2 of my boys came by just after it happened. Ran right down here and this one was empty. Guy took the keys and beat it." "Damn strange," said Daniels. "We'll get him," said the sergeant. "Even if the other Joe don't conk out. He'll be in plenty of trouble. Leaving the scene of an accident. Likely he caused it." "Sure," said Daniels. "Guess that's why he ran." "They never learn," said the sergeant. "Well, good night, sir." He went off toward the Olds. Daniels got his hands on the bag again, and this time he slid into the trees without being challenged. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Murder Mistress by Robert Colby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 3. 10 miles and 10 minutes later, she said, "It sounds like you had a very close call with that sergeant. I don't know how to thank you." "Yes, I do. With that $500. First, I want to have a look at the suitcase." "Don't you trust me?" "Don't be silly, of course. But naturally, I'm concerned about my things." "Hold the wheel a minute," he said. "I'll reach back and get it for you." "Never mind," she said. "One accident is enough." Before he could protest, she climbed over the seat. With a pretense of looking straight ahead disinterestedly, he flicked his eyes to the rearview mirror. He could see only her head, bent low and away from him. With a deft movement, he gave the mirror a quick down-twist. Now he could see, though vaguely. She had the lid of the case open. He couldn't make out the contents. She was groping around. Her head turned once to check him. He held his position, and she returned her attention to the case. He still couldn't see. But then a car passed from the other direction, and for a moment, light flared over the back seat. She had a stack of bills in her hand, straining to see and count. But this was small change. She was right when she said she could afford the $500. The case beneath her hand was crammed to overflowing with a sea of green bills. For all its width and depth, it contained nothing else but money. Daniels couldn't take his eyes from the mirror. When he did look down, the car was veering across the road. He had to resist the temptation to yank the wheel and give himself away. For the next few moments, he raced around in mental circles of useless speculation. As he watched her close the case and swing agilely back to her seat, he thought, just because it's an ocean of money in a suitcase, why does it have to be suspicious? There could be a dozen explanations, but my God, so much money. How much? She opened the alligator purse and made a show of counting out the bills which she had placed there seconds before. $500, she said, and passed him the money. With only a glance, he put the bills in his pocket. "Thanks," he said. "And believe me, I earned it. Your clothes all in order?" "Uh-huh, fine." "Why don't you tell me about it, Valerie? Leave out names and specific details if you like. Just the general problem. I might be able to help." "No thanks. Everything will be all right. Now." "Not exactly," he said. "They'll check the registration of that Cadillac back to your friend. Then they'll come looking for him. But let's say he's moved. They still know who he is, and they will have impounded a very expensive automobile. It doesn't make sense." "It does if you know the car was rented." In that case, don't you care what happened to your friend?
I imagine I'll know where to find him, and that's absolutely all you'll get out of me.
Okay, Valerie. Sorry you won't let me help beyond the call of that 500. So now you're on your own. $500. A windfall that would pay his expenses to New York and still leave better than 300. Myrna would explode with joy, though perhaps her joy would be a little dimmed by the complex manner in which he came by the money. In truth, he wished he had not seen the contents of the suitcase. For what might have been only a strange and exciting adventure in which he was paid handsomely for his daring had become something a little soiled with doubt and suspicion. In the back of his mind there was even a nudge of guilt. He should know the source of that money, but since the money was dumb and Valerie resisted examination, there was nothing gained in punishing himself with worry. He would think about it another time, when there was no chance of his doing anything so foolishly righteous as giving it back. He had called Myra early that morning. It had been a brief conversation. He had not told her the details, only that nothing tangible had worked out. There was no point in spending the money to relate a complete sob story long distance. Myra would only brood, and her office girl day would be spoiled. He left her with the feeling that there was at least some small hope, but was there really? All the faces he had looked into had been smiling with cold eyes. He did not see in them the smallest wedge of re-entry to his former world of television announcing, where the camera eye revealed him to 50 or more million people a week, and his tax deductions alone had once been 5 times his present salary. They rode mostly in silence. Occasionally he asked her a carefully calculated question, but her answers were just as carefully evasive. They reached the northern outskirts of Miami. He swung over to Biscayne Boulevard. Traffic was sparse on the broad boulevard in the first hour of the morning. He was tired, but his weariness was overcome by a latent excitement. What part of town, Valerie? I could drop you.
Thanks anyway. Just go down Biscayne to the center. At one of the hotels there should be a taxi.
This time of night, why don't you just let me take you? He urged. No gallantry now. It seemed important and even necessary to know where she lived. If you live on this side, there's no point driving all the way in.
I don't.
The beach, then?
No.
South?
No.
I go west myself.
A taxi goes in any direction, and I'm in no hurry.
She sat deep in her seat, arms folded, eyes ahead. She sounded cool and withdrawn. For all her crispness, there was about her a lost quality, yet nothing even vaguely suggestive of the criminal mentality. Absurd. No, not absurd. In 10 minutes he had paused at the curb on a side street before the entrance to one of the big hotels which peered across the bay to the commercial opulence of Miami Beach. A taxi waited just beyond. For a moment, while he had his hand on the grip of the bag to unload it, he thought of accusing her openly. Valerie, I saw what you have in this suitcase. You must admit the whole business has a bad smell. Now, either you give me an extremely plausible explanation, or we drive to the nearest police station. It sounded corny and overdramatic when he played it back. There was no law against carrying large sums of money. And further, though innocent, he had been a kind of accomplice after the fact, especially when he accepted that 500 he needed so badly. So he swung the bag to the walk while her eyes followed his every movement. He knew she would gladly have made the exertion herself if it would not seem odd. The cabbie opened her door, then hoisted the bag in front with him. Watching her pretty face, Daniels could almost hear her cry of protest.
Well, thank you, she said quickly. Thank you for everything.
Everything was well paid for. Sure it won't leave you short? He almost smiled.
Not at all.
Her eyes begged him to hurry. I don't even know your full name.
Millions of people don't, and they get along.
Will I see you again?
I think never. Now, please, I'm so terribly tired.
Good night, then, Valerie.
Goodbye.
She watched him coldly. He stepped back a pace, gave her a small salute, and waited. That didn't work either because she merely turned and said,
Straight ahead, driver. I'll tell you.
The cab moved off. She didn't look back. Watching the tail light slowly recede, he had the most dreadful sense of loss. Not of her in any personal sense, naturally, but of something which might connect with her that had been welling up in his mind, only to fall back again into the abyss of memory. Then, as the taxi cornered north a block away, he caught the memory by the tail and heaved it up for inspection. Again he was driving crosstown in the jigsaw of Manhattan traffic, half listening to a newscast which contained a terse item datelined Miami. It was a rather uninformative follow-up on a story which 3 days ago should have earned headlines. 3 days ago he was on the road north, not reading newspapers, but thinking. Here in New York, lost more than ever in the depressing labyrinth of his own problems, the item called from him only a fleeting observation. That if he was at home and on the meager staff announcing job at the radio-TV station from which he had been vacationed, the story might come to him as a special assignment, at least an interview with certain officials. The thought was gone as he flipped the dial for music. Now of all times, as the taxi disappeared, the item came flashing back, grew into banner headlines. The connection was fantastically remote, and yet the squeal of his tires jarred the silence and was echoed back in the empty street. The gaping features of a startled doorman flashed into limbo. The coroner rushed to meet him. He turned it sharply. His thought process had not been involved. The caption recalled, the possible association made, then the leap for the car. Consequently, the time gap had been minor. Thus, he had been able to gain enough ground to see the cab swing right again toward Biscayne. He was faintly surprised when, at the intersection, it turned north along the boulevard, in the very direction from which they had come. Still, it seemed characteristic. She would let him take her right past her door and on into town if it served her purpose. He kept his distance, always a block or more. He let traffic interpose and cover him. It was not a difficult thing to do. With its lighted dome to advertise itself, the cab was easy to identify. His own car was an inconspicuous gray sedan. He followed past the docks along the bay, the MacArthur Causeway to the beach, the darkened glass facade of Marsh's department store. Back over the identical route. Another mile, and the taxi wheeled east toward the bay. He took his time. If they went down that street, it must be her street. And if so, there would be only a few blocks and a dead end at the water. He didn't make the turn. Too obvious. He paused to look, lights out. The cab was halted somewhere in the middle of the second block. That presented a small problem. He didn't dare follow. Not yet. And it was impossible to distinguish precisely which house or apartment building. He watched. The cab nosed into a drive, backed and returned towards him. He pulled to the curb, then when the taxi was forced to wait at the stop sign, he jumped out and ran over. "Say, driver," he said, "you remember me. I delivered the lady to your cab. She left something in my car. I've only been here once, and I can't remember the street number. Can you give it to me?" The driver stared at him with a look of secret amusement. "She didn't give me no number, buddy. She just says, 'Stop here.' So I stopped. Big white stucco. A double-header with one of them fancy iron lamps out front. Right side. Can't miss it." "Thanks," said Daniels, and gave him the dollar he had been twisting noticeably in his finger. "Funny thing," said the driver, pocketing the bill and shoving it into gear. "That place is all shuttered up. You know, them hurricane shutters? When you find out how they breathe in there, let me know." He snickered. "So long, buddy." He gunned off. Headlights on, Daniels sped down the street, found the white stucco with the wrought iron lamp, and braked. No doubt about it, the eyes of the two-story house were sealed over with broad, firm expanses of aluminum panels, the usual measure taken by winter residents who had gone north for the summer. It was hurricane protection which left the house without a livable degree of light or air. Nevertheless, he got out and made a circle of the premises. No sneaky light glowing from beneath shutters anywhere. Front and back doors panel sealed. No guest cottage at the rear. No garage apartment. No Valerie. Either she had known that he was following, or she had acted on a hunch. Once the cab had departed, she must have gone off on foot, carrying an inestimable amount of money. Thousands. Hundreds of thousands? 500,000? Yet, why did she choose this location as a dodge? Unless it was familiar. Walking with a heavy suitcase, she had to live close by. So, clever as she was not infallible. A careful check of the surrounding area might turn up some clue. She had one big strike against her. She was markedly attractive. Pretty girls are often remembered by not-so-pretty neighbors, and what man would forget her? In spite of these deductions, Daniels was unhappy as he drove away. If he had remembered the newspaper item and connected it a minute earlier, a fortune in rewards for information leading to the arrest and conviction of persons unknown might be his. If he found Valerie again, it would be an exhausting, plodding task. But now he was more determined than ever. A voice whispered that his intuition was correct. and if tomorrow he had to canvass every house and apartment building in a radius of a half-mile, he would find her. At this moment, Valerie was in the phone booth of a bar 3 blocks away. She had known that the man who called himself Scott Daniels was growing suspicious. He asked too many questions. He wasn't on the make, either. It was something else. She shouldn't have offered him so much money. Yet, she had to get results, and the $500 was an irresistible offer. She couldn't risk getting the bag herself. Her sad tale, though not without a grain of truth, might have sounded a little phony to him, but she couldn't think of a better one. That was nothing, however, if he knew what was in the suitcase. Even so, he acted strangely. During the drive in the cab, she had held her vanity mirror handy. She kept watching to see if he followed as she powdered her nose and pretended to inspect herself. She couldn't tell. The cars behind were many and so anonymous. Certainly, if he followed, he must be far back. But, as Clay once said, never take chances, never assume that you have covered yourself. In any questionable situation, act as though you are in serious danger of discovery, and only the cleverest maneuvering will save you. So she had ordered the driver to proceed north along Biscayne until she told him to turn. That way she could watch a while to be certain. And when she instructed him to go right at that random street and stop at that random house, it had been just another step in obedience to caution. Immediately after the cab had gone, she had cut through the backyard of the house, across the adjoining property to the next street, and on up to the first corner. Then she had walked south 2 more blocks and west almost to Biscayne. She was now at the point from where the cab she had spied the bar. All the way the suitcase had been growing heavier. But what a beautiful, beautiful heaviness. Actually, a whole lifetime of lightness. The bar had an entrance on the side street, and she had slipped quickly inside. Finding the phone booth at the far end of the dim interior, she had consulted the directory. Leaving the door open and squeezing the case partway inside where it touched reassuringly against her, she placed the coin and dialed. Now she gave her location and told the voice to send a taxi in all possible haste to the side street door. She would be watching. They must have radioed a cab floating not far away, for it was there in only a few minutes. She took the bag with her in the back seat and this time gave the driver a specific address. In less than 10 minutes they were cruising the MacArthur Causeway toward the beach, and she was looking over her shoulder across the bay at the sweetly blazing skyline of Miami, calm in the certainty that she wasn't followed. They did not pursue the causeway to the beach, but turned off where there was a narrow bridge which led to an island. On this island were many beautiful homes along several curving streets. The driver selected one and tooled the cab almost to its end. He paused before one of the least pretentious of the houses, a modern ranch house design of beige stucco and redwood trim in complete darkness. She paid the driver and refused his offer of help with the bag. She went around the side and got the key from where it was wedged behind the gas meter. Then she returned to the front door. She was groping for the lock when the door opened swiftly. She went rigid with shock, then exhaled sharply.
"Clay," she sobbed. "I didn't think you'd be back so soon. Thank God. Oh, thank God."
End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Murder Mistress by Robert Colby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. He took the bag and pulled her inside, shutting the door. The curtains were already drawn. He lighted a single lamp and turned. He was a tall man in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, hard of muscle. He had dark red hair gone a little gray at the sides. Except for a nose, which was slightly aquiline, his tanned features were strongly attractive. He wore slacks and a Madras sports shirt. A small bandage was taped over his left temple. There was about him an air of refinement and command. Neither spoke. With a look of complete astonishment, he glanced from Valerie to the suitcase. She rushed toward him, and they embraced. As he kissed her, he let one big hand follow the heaving curve of her breast beneath the green silk. He undid 2 buttons of the blouse, kissed her neck and shoulder, the top swell of her breasts. Again he kissed her mouth, then pushed her away gently. "You got the money," he said. She smiled. "My God, what a woman. How did you ever do it?"
"When you didn't come, I guessed what happened."
She sank into a chair and lighted a cigarette with a trembling hand.
"Only, I thought it was worse for you. I begged a ride from a man. We stopped at the wreck, and I sent him to find out. The convertible was there, but you were gone. You said you were going to transfer the suitcase to the trunk of the Cadillac and drive off before anyone came. Since you were able to walk away from the crash, I assumed that you had the money and that either you'd gone off with it on foot or it was in the trunk of the Cadillac. It seemed stupid not to know for sure, so I gave this fellow my keys and sent him to open the trunk. I had to make it worth his while. There's more to it, but the important thing is that you're all right, darling. You're safe and you're all right, aren't you?
I'm all right, yes. At least I am now. He paced the room. It just didn't go the way we planned. After I left you, I drove until I spotted Marty coming the other way in the Olds, about 2 miles south of where we went off the road. I let him get out of sight in my mirror, then swung around and caught up. I pretended to be passing. I was counting on surprise. Cut in and shove him off the road into a crack-up. Cut out again, fast, and stop. But I cut too sharp. I hit him with the right rear fender. Then our bumpers locked and I lost control. But I was set for some such emergency and my reactions were faster. He got the worst of it. He never knew who it was or what really happened. I went off the shoulder and down into the gully. I smacked a tree and glanced off. That was where I hit my head. I blacked out and came to again. Blood was trickling from my head and pouring from my nose. All over me. I knew I'd have to hurry. The Olds had turned on its side. I stumbled over to it. Marty was slumped across the seat. He looked dead or unconscious. It was a nightmare in that crazy position, but I got the keys out of the switch and the bag out of the trunk. I put the keys back. Still, no car had come along. The Cadillac was banged up, but looked like it would run okay. There was room to back around and plow out of there. I tossed the suitcase in the trunk and tried to start. She turned over, but wouldn't catch. Just wouldn't catch. I was ready to give up and go off with the suitcase on foot when I saw lights on the highway. A patrol car pulled up. They must have been cruising not too far behind. They threw a spotlight on the Olds and began to swing toward me. I took the keys and ducked out the door on the other side. I crawled off into the trees and watched. 2 cops came running down. They split up, each one taking a car. One of them began flashing his light around for me, and I crawled in deeper. Then the mob started to come. And another police car. It looked hopeless. Not a chance to get the money. Besides, I was weak and sick and drenched with blood. Dead giveaway if anyone got a look at me. It was a ridiculous risk to try for that suitcase. There were empty cars down a side road. Some joker in a Pontiac left his motor running. I stole it. Went back to the roadhouse, pulled up to the door, and looked in. You were gone. Must have passed you on the way. I beat it just as some big slob was coming out. I took the coast route and came home. I was sitting here in the dark, trying to figure an angle on that suitcase, when you came up with it.
What about the Pontiac?
I drove it home, cleaned up, and changed my clothes. Then I took it back to town, parked it, and taxied out.
Fingerprints?
Gloves. You hear anything about Marty when you were there?
Not dead, evidently, but in the hospital. He won't be around for a while.
Good. Oh, God, Val, what would I do without you? Go pour us one on the rocks, and then come and tell me the rest of it. When she had left the room, he carried the suitcase to a chair and opened it. Slowly, absently, he began to finger the bills. Scott Daniels wheeled west at 36th Street and pushed for home. The tension and excitement under which he had been operating for so many hours had left him depleted. He was suddenly exhausted, and there was in him a sense of complete failure. True, he had the equivalent of 5 weeks' salary, but mentally he had already placed the $500 in escrow pending proof of its real origin. Valerie wasn't going to that much trouble to conceal herself unless he had been close to some tremendous secret, perhaps the secret between the lines of the newspaper item. Close. But close wasn't good enough. It didn't buy your way out of semi-poverty, which was compounded by the fact that once you had enough riches and success to make the present doubly drab in contrast. And the trip to New York had been a bust. A total bust. Milt Lundberg, in charge of TV productions at the Freeman Pellet and Weber Agency, had been condescending on the phone. He and Debbie Lundberg had been guests at their penthouse in Forest Hills, and the lakeside cottage in the Adirondacks. How many times? But now the bastard was downright patronizing as he spoke from that swivel throne in his office.
Didn't know you were in town, old man. Who you selling for?
It's a vacation, Milt. If I had a sponsor, you'd be one of the first to know it. I'm not selling in this town. That's what I want to see you about. There was a beat of silence, pregnant with self-protective overtones.
Well, now, listen, kiddo. No can do today. Meeting with the brass in 10 minutes. That'll scuttle the morning. Lunch with some VPs at CBS. 2 client conferences in the afternoon. That clobbers the hell out of the whole day. Might be able to squeeze you in the first of next week, though. Tell you what, check with Billy next Monday. You remember Billy, my secretary? Sure you do. Well, check with Billy, Monday, a.m. She'll set you up with a time. Best I can do, baby. Okay?
Lundberg had elected not to remember that he had a fine apartment overlooking the East River where friends could be invited in the evening. Hell no, Milt, said Daniels. It isn't okay. I won't be in town but 2, maybe 3 days. We'll skip it, Milt. You're busy. I know just how it is.
Well, now, wait a minute, Scott. Just hold on a minute. Can't let you get away, old friend and all.
Lundberg saving face while figuring the least.
I'll stay over a few minutes and invite you for dinner. But we have company. Come by the office at 4:30 sharp. Good enough?
Then Lundberg in his office, swiveling, doodling with a black and gold pen behind a cloud of cigar smoke. A tall, thin man, pale and parrot-nosed, hair dark and sparse, bushy brows over gray-green eyes of many moods, all of them shrewdly acquisitive in one way or another. Facets of a personality that went all too unnoticed in the mists of approval in the time of the feast.
So you got a good thing cooking there, Miami, hey, Scott? The star rises again, but now in the subtropic heavens.
Very poetic, Milt.
My God, I envy you, old man. Christ, if I could ever get out of this empire of soot and garbage. Lays around on those clean beaches, rum coolers and palm trees. A very good thing, buddy boy.
Sure, said Daniels. A very good thing at $100 a week.
Well, now, after all, it takes time, you know.
Yeah, it takes time to build yourself up to 125 tops. Come on down, Milt. Talk realities. I want out of a nowhere staff announcing job in Miami. And back to the big bundle of freelance gravy here. It's been a good sinless year now. That should be long enough for the soap chip and toothpaste guardians of the air lanes to forgive and forget. The pen paused in stroke, was returned to the holder in the onyx base. Lundberg sat back complacently and shook his head.
I'm sorry, Scott. They seldom forgive, and they almost never forget. It's one hell of a big family. But it's a family, and the word travels. They know about you, from here to Podunk and Paducah.
Crap, come off, Milt. That's a generality. Sure, there's some who know, or guess, but the majority don't. They knew nothing about me in Miami, except that I was once a big deal. I started clean.
Then you were lucky, and my best advice is to stay there and build a new reputation.
I came in here to ask you to give me a crack at something, Milt. Something small to start. You could do it. You could bend the right ears with the right words. Scott Daniels has changed, Mr. Dobbs. You wouldn't know him. He downs a very occasional beer. He hasn't had a hard drink in over a year. Still one of the best announcers in the business. Let's give him another whirl.
That's all you'd have to say. What about it, Milt?
Lundberg swung to the window and back.
I'd like to, Scott, but I can't. They wouldn't hear of it upstairs. I couldn't stick my neck out that far. I sit in this chair, but I'm not fastened to it. See what I mean? If this was a penny ante, it would be different. But we're playing with big money. Thousands, millions. One goof and we might lose an account that would wipe out a whole department. I believe in you, Scott, but that's not enough. Get a staff job on one of the nets here. Ease your way in. Then I'll root for you.
Fine, Milt. Thanks a lot. You'll root for me when I'm practically home. Thanks a lot. And of course, you'll pick up the phone and get me that staff job for a start, won't you? Lundberg's face closed.
No need for that kind of talk, Scott. I'm sorry. But I didn't lift a bottle to your lips.
He looked at his watch.
Gotta run, kiddo. Keep in touch. I might hear of something.
And over at the network stations, Carlton Lovelace at NBC.
My God, if we had anything at all, Scott, you wouldn't even have to audition. But unfortunately, we're already overstaffed.
Bill Dixon at CBS. And I really am sorry we have a tight budget, Scott, because we need a man of your caliber. Don't doubt for a minute you're on the wagon. Has no bearing on the situation. Drop in any time. George McDougal at American. Of course, there's the vacation relief job. Man we had got is sick and we're on overtime. I might be able to swing it with Hartley on some kind of probationary basis, but it's only good for about 3 months, fella. And you wouldn't want that now, would you? There was the small difference in phrasing, but all over town the sum total of the answers was the same. We don't gamble on drunks, reformed or otherwise. Nothing for Scott Daniels. Not that he had ever been by any stretch of the imagination an alcoholic. He just had a few drinks to loosen up before he walked on stage for an important show. And then one time he forgot where to stop, and overnight the loosening process had become plain freewheeling. Essentially, it was a matter of premature advancement. He had too much talent and too little ego. His self-conception always lagged behind his ability. A dangerous situation in a profession where even an obvious mistake before the millions had to be carried off with such a plume that the audience applauded the natural and graceful manner in which the performer fell flat on his face. Beneath the studied glossy front which Daniels had presented to the camera lens, he couldn't overcome a devastating fear that he was being hurled too high too fast. It was the presence of this fear, not the absence of talent, which had been his undoing. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Murder Mistress by Robert Colby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 5. Daniels parked the car in the lot beside the building. Looking up 2 stories, he could see that there was a light from behind the curtain of their bedroom window. After 2 a.m., and Myra still up, waiting, or asleep with an open book and limp fingers. The moment he closed the door behind him, he heard the padding of bare feet down the hall. Scampering toward him, wearing one of his pajama tops that came to her knees, how tiny she looked without the lift of her high heels. Her auburn hair bounced along across her shoulders. Typically, she had not put it up in the bobby-pinned ugliness which she knew he detested, because he told her it made her gammon face look naked as a light bulb.
I was getting worried, she said against his shoulder, arms pulling him tight. You said before midnight, and...
He kissed her gently. Oh, faithful, still up, he said. God, it's good to see you, hun. Sorry you worried. There were complications and no handy phones. Man, I am beat. But talkative. Let's get comfortable. He began to walk with her toward the bedroom.
Where's your suitcase, dear?
Damn, he said. Left it in the car. Never mind. It's locked away and I'm too tired. Nothing I'll need before morning. In the bedroom, he stripped down to his shorts and lay back against the pillows, smoking with an ashtray on his chest. She sat cross-legged, facing him. Her neat little features were made up with the same precise care she might employ if they were about to set forth for some grand and formal affair. All for him. Even in the absurd pajama tops, she managed to look smart and neat. In spite of the hour, her brown eyes were alert with interest.
All right, she teased. What complications? A complicated blonde?
No, a complicated brunette. She laughed. You think I'm kidding?
Probably, but before you make me too jealous to listen, tell me about New York. What did Milt Lundberg say besides? No.
It doesn't seem important now.
Please.
He told her briefly about Lundberg and the others.
I hate them all,
she said. Don't bother. In a way, you can't blame them.
Smug, self-righteous little men.
Self-protective, he corrected. She lighted a cigarette and waved off the smoke with a gesture of annoyance.
It isn't as if you were some incurable alcoholic fresh from an institution. What do they want? Signed affidavits? All you did was go off the deep end a few times. In that ulcer contest, it could happen to anyone. Oh, I wish you had never accepted that ridiculous quiz show 7-11. Even the name is silly. You had to be loaded to watch it, let alone conduct it. Actually, you almost turned it down.
Almost, he said. I had a feeling about it. I knew I wasn't ready, but how do you say no to 1,000 a week? And especially to that little man inside you who forever after would be whispering that you're a gutless wonder. How do you do that?
You don't, she said. You had to take it.
She sighed.
Poor lamb, you look exhausted. Don't you want to sleep? We can talk in the morning. Nothing seems so grim in sunlight.
You'll be rushing off to work, he said. Besides, it won't keep.
Then I'm going to build a pot of coffee. Be right back. Wait for me, darling.
He smiled. I love you, baby, he said. She blew him a kiss. Absently, he watched the cute sway of her bottom beneath the trail of his pajama top as she departed for the kitchen. He looked around the bedroom with its shabby rented furniture. It would have been better, he thought, if I had turned it down. But how do you say no? At the same time the quiz show was offered him, he didn't need the extra income. Too quickly he had traveled the climbing announcer's road from small independent station to network staff to freelance New York, the big money terminus for television. He had accomplished this in 4 years when some took 10 and most never made it at all. He was more surprised than anyone else at his success, calling it a matter of breaks and timing. He never felt quite seasoned or prepared, always a little afraid of sudden failure. He had a nice freelance package going for him, nothing too tricky or painfully demanding. He had contracts to announce the commercials on 2 coast-to-coast soap operas, a nighttime national newscast, and a half-hour suspense drama. In every case, he sold different products for the same basic sponsor, an enormous company with many lines. He was answerable to the Freeman Pellet and Weber Advertising Agency, who serviced the account. Occasionally, he did voice tracks for the newsreels. Altogether, in round figures, it was good for a very cozy $1,200 a week. Of course, you had to have a good voice and a pleasant selling personality. And you had to understand timing in stage business, exhibiting the product with poise and naturalness. But in the main, it was a matter of reading someone else's script from a teleprompter in such a deceptive way that it appeared to come right from the old heart. It was tense but not overwhelming, and he would have been content to leave the status quo indefinitely. But no. The sponsor thought he was great, and had sales figures to prove it. For all practical purposes, Leland Dobbs, the executive vice president, was the sponsor, and like most sponsors, Dobbs didn't understand the tremendous difference between reading from a teleprompter and conducting the intricate proceedings of a national quiz show. This required a skilled master of ceremonies who could gracefully ad-lib his way through the snarl of contestants, juggle questions, make decisions, be passably amusing, buttress commercials with a few well-chosen words of his own, and give the impression he was having one hell of a good time doing it. But Daniels knew the difference, and he was plain scared when Dobbs insisted he wouldn't have anyone else for the new 7-come-11 quiz, but Scott Daniels. At a small station he might stumble through, relaxed enough to come up smelling pretty, but with a nationwide show involving a mint of money, there were grave doubts. He wouldn't forget that opening night. It was a masterpiece of confusion. In rehearsal, Burt Masters, the director, a sour-faced, cold-eyed bastard, had been riding him mercilessly. From the beginning, Masters had wanted in for his own boy, Dick Hurley. Rumor had it that Hurley kicked back part of his fees on the shows Masters got him. In any case, Masters seemed out to destroy his composure. At airtime, he stood tense, uncomfortably rigid in the hot glare. The red lights winked on beneath the camera. The muscles of his face felt wooden. Lips formed into a frozen smile. He looked into the lens and saw, not the millions of viewers, not the giant shadow of the audience beyond the lights, not, from eye corner, the busyness of technicians and floormen, but the sullen, contemptuous features of Burt Masters. Just for a second, the image hung there, and then he heard his own voice, saying none of the things he had carefully planned, but strange inverted sentences, awkwardly composed. From the lead-in forward, it was bedlam. Most of the contestants were dull, and he had to carry them. Yet one woman talked too much, and he couldn't silence her gracefully, though the show was running long. Meanwhile, everything he said came back to him stilted, self-conscious. Who was it quipped? The best ad-libs are written. Where were the casual lines of the teleprompter? Somehow in the control room, where the offender, probably Masters, was never visual, the sequence of the action became confused. They tossed him an early cue for the commercial. He gave the introduction, and then the girl who was to play housewife was off stage. The camera came back to him, and he had to stall for an eon of time until she was ready. Then, for some unimaginable reason, the electronic score computer failed to totalize, and for a span he had to do sums in his head when his brain was already crowded with a dozen other details. Everything went wrong. And though most of it could be blamed on the kinks of a first night, he had failed to turn defeat into a personal victory by the casual remark, the apt and humorous phrase. After the show, wringing wet to his socks, he was cornered by Masters. "My God, Daniels, what hayseed windmill station did you blow in from? You want us to write the whole thing out on an idiot board 6 feet high? You couldn't talk your way out of a parking ticket if you own the street. Jesus, you're about as casual as rigor mortis on ice. That was the worst god-awful mess I've witnessed in years. But don't worry about it, lover. I have a sneaking suspicion someone's on the phone right now asking for a new boy." Daniels almost hit him. Instead, he said, "Why don't you recommend Dick Hurley?" and walked away. The funny thing was that he met Hurley at Schraft's the next day, and Hurley said with a perfectly bland face, "Caught your show last night, Daniels." "Well, don't take it too hard. All your luck was stacked the wrong way." Hurley was giving his sincere commercial while placing you off guard for the kill. But he had a lot of experience as MC. "How would you have handled it, Dick?" "Just relax and kid hell out of it. Turn it into a comedy skit. Frankly, you were a little stiff. You had me sweating. You need a couple more shows behind you. Sometimes I belt 2 or 3 down before I go on. It helps. Try it. Loosen you up." Thanks, I might do that, if I'm not watching at home. But Lundberg said that, while Dobbs was disappointed, he had faith that next week Daniels would improve. An hour before showtime, he was falling apart. He had 3 straight shots and couldn't feel anything but a flush creeping like fever to his face. However, he did somewhat better, and at least there was variety. Different things went wrong. The 3rd week, he drank Manhattans in the bar downstairs, a half dozen. His reactions were slow, his thinking a little vague. A few things got fouled up, but beautifully he didn't care. He was tempted to snicker right out loud. Once he did. Lundberg said, "You're going to the other extreme, Scott. You're not easy, you're almost limp. Tighten up, make it brighter." Now the strain was showing in between. He had lost confidence and began to take a few shots before his less demanding shows. Sometimes he slurred his words. Once he lost a whole paragraph. Directorial eyes grew thoughtful under creased brows. He was getting the silent treatment at FP&W. Lundberg came right out with it. "What's wrong with you lately, buddy boy? Sick? Need a vacation?" The 4th week of 7-11, he was drunk. Not falling down, but giddy-minded, body-floating drunk. He concealed it to airtime with a superhuman effort. He opened the show with a frenzied burlesque of an MC on fire with enthusiasm. He hurried everything along at a militant, comically fast pace. He was having a wonderful time. Then suddenly he ran out of gas, and when his cue came to lead into the ad-lib close and sponsor plug, he stood loose-jawed and wordless before a live camera coast to coast. He had nearly 2 minutes to fill, and all he could do was stand there and wave, saying over and over, "Good night, good night, good night all." They had to cover with reams of music, shots of the audience, and the word stretching of the booth announcer. Meanwhile, he had stumbled off stage and collapsed cold in the wings. Except for a few professionals, the watching world never really caught on. But he was finished. Masters saw to that. Gone also were his other shows, for the same angry sponsor controlled them all. Within 3 days, most everyone in that tight little unforgiving world knew. All the unseen doors of re-entry were closed. For a while he did nothing but live up to his reputation. Once an insurance salesman who came to the apartment asked him conversationally what he did for a living. "I drink," he said. "Now get out and let me get back to work." When most of the small capital he had put away was gone, and there was no income other than the rental of the lakeside cottage, he answered an ad in a trade publication. "Opening for a highly experienced announcer in top Florida market. 40-hour week. $90. Excellent future. Send tape, photo, and background. References required." There was a box number, care of the publication. Lundberg gave him a reference with his usual condescension. He didn't need it. He was well known. Fortunately, the reason for his disappearance from the monitor screens in their control room was a mystery to the Miami station. He supplied a reason of his own, temporary loss of health with the present need of a new climate. They were glad to get him. In time, he got a $10 raise, a very big deal. Except for an occasional beer, he had lived in total abstinence. And through it all, Myra reasoned, comforted, adjusted downward without complaint, and took a secretarial job. No wonder theirs had become an inviolate closeness. She entered now with coffee and cinnamon toast on a tray. "You look terribly thoughtful," she said as he munched and sipped in silence. Again, he glanced around the bleak, heat-soggy room. He was struck by a sickening wave of depression. Myra, baby, what happened to it all? Gone, gone. She reached over and stroked his head. "It's not so terribly important, darling. I don't mind. I mean it. In a different way, haven't we been just as happy? What's gone? Pressures? The mad chase? Cocktail parties? Our fair weather politic friends? We've had time for each other, and there's a certain crazy, laughable unity in just making do. We talk for hours, and we read books, and go to movies, and take walks. So don't be sad, sweetheart. What's gone that we can't really do without?" "My face is gone from better than 50 million screens a week," he said. "Money gone, the big car, furniture, clothes. And the feeling that I'm not a failure. That's what's gone." He wanted to cry. "But, baby, you're not gone. Stick around, will you? Like forever." She kissed him. "Like forever." She smiled. "But not if you can't stay away from complicated brunettes. Was there really a brunette?" He reached for his trousers across a chair next to the bed. From a pocket, he produced the $500. "See this?" He held up the roll. It was given to me by that complicated brunette for services rendered. $500.
500? She said. That's a lot of service. You're not serious, are you?
For the first time, he inspected the money closely. Old bills, he said. Disappointing.
Old bills, new bills. What's the difference? It spins.
You can't trace old bills, he answered thoughtfully.
Can't trace them? What on earth are you talking about now?
He gave her an exact accounting of the adventure.
So, what does it all mean? She said.
It means that if we can't spend this $500 now, we might be able to bank $50,000 later. That would be the aggregate reward from various sources, namely a local newspaper, the bank, and the city government. It amounts to about 10% of the total theft.
Please, honey, make sense.
He mashed his cigarette, removed the tray, and sat up sharply. While I was gone, he said, in fact, about the same day I hit the road, don't you remember a very sensational story in the paper concerning an armed robbery with a take of $500,000 or so? She looked at him blankly, then her eyes widened, her mouth worked.
The Second National Bank?
Of course.
2 men wearing masks, she said quickly. They held up the chief teller seconds after an armored truck made a payroll transfer from the First National. Perfect timing. The biggest haul since the Brinks robbery.
Right, he said. Anything else?
Yes. Someone sounded the alarm, she said excitedly. There was a squad car just a few blocks away, and headquarters flashed it. The police were there in a couple of minutes. Then the whole area was blocked off. They never could figure out how the crooks got away. It seemed impossible. Not a trace of them. Not a single clue.
Exactly, he said.
And you think the money in that suitcase?
The odds are good, but so far it's just a hunch.
And you have a plan?
I'm figuring one. And I've got 6 days vacation left to work it out.
Sounds dangerous, darling. Don't take chances. Why don't you talk to Bill Hogue, that detective? The one who took you out cruising around for that show you did, Night Patrol.
I will. After I've done most of the groundwork. Bill's a nice guy, but I don't plan on sharing the spoils. He got up and began to pace slowly.
You ought to get some sleep, dear.
I know. He went over to the window and, parting the curtain, peered out.
It's exciting, she said, and yet frightening too. Do you have any idea where you're going to start?
He looked out upon the low buildings of the littered street, then east to the vast dim radiance of greater Miami. I'm going to start, he said, by looking for a girl somewhere out there named Valerie. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Murder Mistress by Robert Colby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 6. On Tuesday, late the following day, after traveling some 160 miles, Roy Whalen stormed in from Haines City, Florida, and parked his Plymouth sedan beside the Glades garage on Highway 27. He climbed out and leaned against the door, puffing a cigarette, glancing around the building with a look of squinting speculation. He was a medium-sized man of 36, a chunky blonde with pale freckled skin and blunt features. There was nothing in the least remarkable about him, unless you noticed his eyes. They were azure, flawless as fine gems, and just as hard. After a moment he gave the cigarette a high flip, and made his way around the building to the lot which adjoined it, an area of tall grass and broken rows of wrecked automobiles. He spotted the cream and red Olds almost immediately. With a furtive gaze towards the garage and with much indirection, pausing to examine other wrecks, he made his way to it. Pursing his lips, he inspected the crushed right side, the interior with its bent wheel, blood-stained seat, cracked windshield. Then, casually, he circled to the rear. The trunk lid looked closed, but on closer observation appeared to be slightly ajar. He squatted down, his head beneath the bumper, making a fake study of the undercarriage. If anyone came along, he would say he was a body repairman, searching for late-model Olds he could buy for a song and hammer together in his spare time. But as he brought his head up, his eyes came level with the opening, and he was able to see clearly that the trunk was empty. Thus, an entirely different story would be needed. He went now directly to the garage and located the small, cluttered office, inside to the left. Here, a grimy, unshaven butterball of a man in his undershirt penciled what looked like someone's bill for services. He looked up, said, "What's yours, friend?" "Insurance adjuster. You got that Olds 57 sedan. Belonged to Martin Bates." "You were looking right at it a minute ago, friend." Whalen's face didn't alter. That right. Thought so. But I wasn't sure. That's the heap. You got here fast enough. Poor bastard ain't even cold yet. They tell me he kicked off without ever coming to. I know. We got it from one of his relatives. That's the way it goes. Come up from Miami, friend? Yup. You have the damage estimate? With a grunt, the man opened a drawer, brought out a sheaf of papers, selected one, handed it over. My God, said Whalen. This is a beaut. I'll take it along if you've got a copy. Got to. Now, said Whalen, the brother, Matthew Bates, said there were some personal effects. Should be a couple of suitcases. Authorized me to pick 'em up. Just one suitcase, friend. He pointed. That's it up there. Black one on the shelf. Nothing in it but a few shirts, underwear, stuff like that. I was here when the highway boys had a look at it. That's all? No other suitcase? A big tan one? Nope. Cop come in behind the wreck, opened the trunk itself. Just a black one. They couldn't have taken the case out at the scene of the accident? No, not hardly. Never do it that way. Bring the heap in first. Always. For the first time, Whalen was hard put to keep his face empty and his voice under control. Well, Jesus, he said. That's mighty strange. The brother says the case was there. Big tan job. Some clothes in it belonged to him. Other stuff worth a few hundred. It couldn't just walk away without a little help. Now, if he puts in a claim, we'll have to have a pretty thorough investigation. Tell you what, just for the hell of it, give the highway patrol a call and see if they know anything about it. The garage man gave him a look to indicate the insanity of such a proposal, then reached for the phone. After placing the call, he was obviously shuffled around until the informed party was reached. He posed the question, listened, made a few grunts into the mouthpiece, and hung up. Nothing doing, he said. Cops was there first, and that trunk wasn't touched until she was hauled in here. Whalen looked at the man steadily a moment. Something told him the guy wasn't hiding anything. What about the other car in the wreck? The caddy, he said. Luggage in that one? You got a claim on both of them? Whalen shook his head. Just curious. Empty, said the man. And I mean empty. He leaned forward confidentially. A real screwy situation. They never did find the character who was driving it. Ran off somewhere. Then they trace the registration and they find it's a stolen car, unreported. Guy who owns it lives back north, loaded. He has a bunch of cars. He leaves this one in his own garage over Miami Beach. And someone swaps it. This is the first he hears about it. Only this last was news to Whalen. He had read the rest in the late morning paper and had set out immediately, first phoning the hospital to make sure there was no mistake about Marty's death. Damn queer, all right, he said. You can bet your tail we'll be looking into it. Well, thanks a lot, fella. You'll hear from us. You want to leave your car just in case we... Nah, Whalen called over his shoulder at the door. I'll be around. So long. He went out quickly and drove off. As Roy Whalen reached the outskirts of Miami, darkness was settling fast. All the way he had accomplished some serious and much-involved thinking. The whole deal had a very bad stink, and he was going to follow his nose where it led him. It was too bad about Marty. Really, too bad. Marty had been one of the last remaining people in this world he could trust, and there had been a certain special feeling between himself and Marty Bates. Too bad. But in all ways, Whalen was a practical man. When a thing was done, it was done. When a man was dead, he was dead. Real dead. His usefulness was over. No point in raging or weeping around. Both made your mind sloppy when there were things to be done. At a stoplight, Whalen removed the keys from the ignition and opened the glove compartment. From it, he took a snub-nosed .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. The gun felt strange in his hand. Until a week ago, when his life had undergone some fantastic changes, he had never before carried such a weapon. Now he dropped the .38 in his pocket, returned the keys to the switch, restarted, and boomed away. He had a sudden vision of Marty standing in the doorway the night they separated. Marty smiling and saying, "What's the matter, Roy? You look worried. If you think I'll skip, let me check the route out, and you follow later with the dough. I'd trust you with it any time." No, Roy Whalen didn't think Marty Bates had pulled a fast one before he was killed. The disappearance of the person or persons who were in the Cadillac made him believe it happened another way. Another way entirely. And who else but Clay and Valerie knew anything at all about the money? When Clay unlocked the door, Valerie was in the living room pouring martinis into frosted glasses.
"I heard you," she said, "and I knew you'd want one of these."
Her smile was not the broad, reckless thing it had once been for him. She was constantly on edge lately. Nevertheless, there was warmth in her eyes, and she wore that tight pink sweater and a hip snug skirt. He felt the instant surge of desire. He dropped the newspaper on a table, and she handed him the glass. He couldn't sip. He had to gulp it down.
"There's no race, darling," she said. "You're awfully late, aren't you?"
"Tough day," he muttered. "I couldn't seem to concentrate on all that routine crap. Pour me another, will you, honey?" She filled his glass, and he walked around aimlessly, wanting to touch her, but not yet unwound enough to do even that. As he expected, she picked up the paper and began to study it with the frowning intention. "Third page," he said. "Column 4. She flipped the sheet in a flurry of haste. She found it, and for half a minute scanned furiously, biting down on her lip. Then she dropped the paper in a heap and looked up with a broken expression.
"He died,"
she almost whispered.
"He died."
"I admit it's a shock," he said. "But we knew the risk, and there's a certain safety."
"I just didn't expect him to die," she said in an awed tone. "I thought maybe he would be in the hospital a while, and then... Oh, I don't know what I thought. I wish I had never known Marty, never seen him. It's so personal."
"He was nothing to you."
"Well, I know, but after all... Clay, what are we coming to? We should get out of here. Now! There are planes that can take you overnight to anywhere."
"Don't get panicky, Val. Just don't get panicky." He finished the second drink, chewed the olive, sat down, and lit a cigarette. "You know very well I can't possibly leave. How would it look?"
"How long, then?"
"I told you. About 3 months. Sooner if it seems a completely dead issue."
3 months, 3 months. It's a lifetime with your nerves just screaming for relief. I won't be able to take it."
"Yes, you will."
"I ought not to stay here," she said. "I should move back to the apartment. Suppose I was seen by someone in the neighborhood. They don't know your wife is in Reno getting a divorce. It would cause talk, and one thing might lead to another."
"Just stay hidden, Val, honey. That's all."
"I feel like a prisoner. I'm so wretchedly lonely here all day. I want to have fun, Clay. Good times. We have this complete fortune, and what good is it? Worthless."
"You think you wouldn't be more lonely in that apartment? I need you, honey. I need you." She was silent. Then,
"What did you hear about the holdup? Anything new? They don't suspect a thing?"
"Of course not. They're running around in circles. They can't understand how the culprits, as the paper likes to call them, got away. Captain Krause told me he thinks they could have slipped on a plane or a train before the terminal or the depot was put under watch. He's sure they didn't get away by car. All roads were screened tight. It's a joke. What are they going to do without a description? Check every human being in transit anywhere? And his luggage? Still, I'm glad we didn't take chances. The best news is that the cops are looking for professional stick-up artists. I was counting on that. It certainly was clever enough for any professional in the country."
"Exceedingly clever, darling. But I'm in no mood to brag. Not that one brave idea was mine. I'm thinking about Roy. He reads newspapers like anyone else. By tonight or tomorrow he'll be burning his tires in all directions, asking questions, and if the answers don't make sense to him, he has just one more place to go."
"Roy will be a long time getting around to us," Clay answered. "And if it comes to that, I can handle him with my best astonishment and innocence approach. Look at it this way. He has not a thing, not a shred to accuse us with. After we split the cash, we were not supposed to have an inkling of their future plans. How could Roy know you were cozy with Marty? You think Marty would have told him? Not on your life. So then, in Roy's little brain, there is left a conception that we would not know time, place, or even method of their departure. And further, I don't believe he would even guess that I was the type for such a cross."
"Yes, but he doesn't think like you and I, Clay. No subtle shadings. Don't expect him to figure us incapable of anything just because we make pretty talk and have nice manners."
"And further," continued Clay, "the Cadillac doesn't connect and never will. So he's got to come to one of 3 conclusions. Either Marty crossed him and he hid the money, or it was stolen from the car sometime after the so-called accident,
or again, and finally the police have it and are keeping their mouths shut while they check it. Satisfied? Almost. I would be if there wasn't $501,700 involved, and if Roy Whalen wasn't about the most determined animal I ever met. Even if he guessed, said Clay, there isn't a chance he'll find it where it's hidden. She stood and came to him. Let me look at that gash, she said, leaning over him and tilting his head into the light. Not bad from any distance at all. The makeup covers it, and the swelling's gone down. If you didn't have a good tan, you'd be in trouble. Anyone notice it? Not a single mention. Above him, pendulous and swollen, her breasts were a sudden demand for attention. He pulled her down. Darling, aren't you hungry? It's going on. Yes, I'm hungry. For you. He reached under her sweater and with one neat wrench undid her bra. She looked toward the windows. All curtains closed, he said. Later, darling. Now. Well, then why do we stay here? I like to progress slowly from chair to couch to bed, he chuckled. It dates back to my days of fumbling excitement when it never got to the bed. She smiled the old reckless smile and pulled the sweater over her head. She sloped her shoulders and slipped out of the bra. There. Do you like? Her breasts were large but compact and insolently up-tilted. The areas surrounding her nipples were enormous dark circles, bullseye caps to the round peaks of flesh. Fascinated, he stared and stared, then pulled her against him. Make it so we don't think, darling, she murmured, so we never have to think again. But later in the bedroom, when in silence they had both begun to think more clearly than ever, there was the startling sound of someone beating on the front door with increasing tempo and rising impatience. In the glow from the hall light, they looked at each other. He bounced out of bed and began to pull on trousers and shirt over his nakedness. He slipped bare feet into moccasins, then pulled open the drawer of the night table. From it, he took a .45 caliber automatic, flushed around into the chamber, and stuffed the gun into his hip pocket. My God, she moaned, like a gangster in his mall every time someone comes to the door. Shut up and get dressed, he said. Hurry, but stay right here. I'll come for you if I want you. He looked, and the butt of the gun was visible. He pulled his suit coat from the chair and threw it on with his ready mask of dignified annoyance. Trembling, he went out to the door. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Murder Mistress by Robert Colby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 7. Scott and Myra Daniels sat in a booth of the little Italian restaurant around the corner from their apartment. Myra took a sip of the port wine while Scott absently twirled spaghetti around his fork. Sure, I know it had to be done, he said, but just the same, I feel like the whole day was wasted. A big zero. I combed that entire vicinity, block by block. I described that girl like she was my own sister. Exactly 2 leads, both false. But how could I know they were false? I had to check them out, didn't I? More time shot. And did you ever search an entire phone book for Valerie's? Try it sometime. He forked the spaghetti into his mouth. Were there many Valeries? Asked Myra. He swallowed. A whole bunch of them, but not as many as you might imagine. It's not such a common name. I called every last one of them because I think I might recognize her voice. It's kind of throaty and has a, what shall I call it, finishing school quality. And what happened? Said Myra. Well, it was rather complicated. If a man answered, which wasn't too often, thank God, I had one story. If a woman answered, I had another. Mostly I was very formal and pretended that I had the wrong Valerie Glutz, a person I understood to be in Miami but couldn't locate. It didn't matter what I said once I was sure the voice on the other end was not the Valerie. 4 Valeries didn't answer, probably because 3 of them were working girls. I called them again after business hours and got all but 1. However, with the chick I couldn't reach, someone did come to the phone to say that Valerie was her mother and was 67 years old. Hardly my girl, nor were any of the others. Myra frowned, toyed with her salad. Don't you think she might have made the name up? Possibly, but my feeling is that she didn't. In the first place, it doesn't seem logical that if you were going to invent a name, one like Valerie would just pop into your head. Jane, Betty, Helen, Joan, or Martha, maybe, but not Valerie. And in the second place, she was terribly distracted. The name slipped out naturally and without hesitation.
For the time being, I'm going to assume it wasn't a phony. I have to start somewhere.
So she just doesn't have a phone, said Myra. Or it's under her husband's name.
She wasn't wearing a wedding ring, said Scott. Proves nothing, really, but I still don't think she was married. They became busy with their food. Myra was pensive.
Wasn't it awful that that poor man died in the accident?
She said. Grim. Glad I didn't get there in time for a look at him. Bates. Martin Bates. Paper said he was a watchmaker. Had his own little one-man shop downtown somewhere. Scott picked up the folded paper beside him and ran his finger down a column. Says here, he is survived by his brother Matthew Bates, Springfield, Illinois. An employee of the building which houses the clock shop stated that Bates was en route to visit his brother. However, reaching in Springfield, Matthew Bates expressed surprise at this explanation. Mr. Bates said he was not aware of his brother's intention to visit with him. A wide search is underway for the missing hit-and-run driver of the stolen Cadillac involved in the accident. Theft of the car was not learned until... and so on. I told you all about that.
Everything connected with the accident is so odd, said Myra. Of course, the driver of the Cadillac ran because he knew they'd catch him with a stolen car.
To say nothing of a suitcase overloaded with wads of dough, probably just as stolen, added Scott. But why would a guy with that much cash take a chance on stealing an automobile? And in God's name, where the hell was he going when he got in the wreck? Well, it will all come out in the wash, and that's one bundle I want to wash personally. On top of the money reward, it seems like something I just have to do.
Please, please be careful,
said Myra, touching his hand. Oh, I will, hon, if I ever get close enough again to be careful.
What's the plan for tomorrow, then?
Tomorrow I'll go to the Second National Bank, as a reporter type from WKSR-TV. I should be able to wrangle some information on just exactly what happened in the robbery. From there, we'll see. All finished? How about some dessert? We're really splurging tonight.
No thanks, dear, said Myra. I can't work up the least enthusiasm about spumoni.
End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Murder Mistress by Robert Colby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 8. Roy Whalen sat easy in his chair across the living room from Clay. Ever since Clay had opened the door and he strode into the room, Roy had seemed deceptively relaxed, speaking of Marty and the lost money in that breezy and caustic manner which Clay knew was only skin-deep. Tension hung around Whalen like gas from a leaking main. I don't know, he concluded. Guess I just don't have your head for figures, Clay boy. It won't add up. I come out minus $375,000 and Marty gets a big zero for keeps.
Of course I read the newspaper account, said Clay smoothly. And while to me Marty was strictly a business proposition, I was pretty shaken, to say nothing of the fact that it didn't make sense. What was he doing on Route 27, out in the Everglades and completely alone? I thought you two might still be in town, or at least that you would take off somewhere together. But then you never seem willing to discuss your plans, so how could I understand all this?
That's right, said Roy reasonably, nodding his head, pursing his lips. I remember. We never told you a thing. His eyes and the flat features were a study in crystal blue innocence. Not that we didn't trust you, Clay boy. It just seemed like a sharper operation to keep a few items to ourselves. But now that Marty's dead and the cash is nowhere, I can't see any harm in giving you the rundown.
Please do, said Clay. After all, we've got to stick together. It's a dangerous situation, and maybe I can see some possibilities.
That's what I like about you executive types, said Whalen. Real gentlemen, always ready to help in any little Boy Scout emergency.
Never mind the cute sarcasm, Roy, said Clay in his brass tacks, right-on-your-level voice. I know you're bitter about your friend and the money, but...
Especially the money now, said Whalen. 375,000 simoleons, all friends, if I can find them. So we'll can the crap and get down to the meat. Now here's the way it was set up. We had to get rid of our cut. You can't just leave $375,000 sitting around in a suitcase. He smiled slyly. It might get stolen. So we decided the first thing to do was to get it out of the state where it was hot. Not that they could trace old bills, but they would be watching for any large sums to show. After we got it out of the state,
We figured the best place to put it was... where? Where else? Banks, of course. Lots and lots of banks. So we had it mapped out to cross into the nearest state. Peachakeensville, USA, Georgia. Then we would haul over to Atlanta, a nice big city, and there we would go down to a half dozen or more of that city's staunchest banks and open accounts, each one in his own dreamed-up name. Nothing big, you understand, that would be dangerous. Not a penny over $5,000 per account. No raised eyebrows at all. But that wouldn't end it. We would hang around for 3-4 days, making deposits on these accounts up to 10-15 grand each bank. It's opening the account you have to be careful. After, who's to question deposits? Some jerk teller? Hell no. Right, Clay? That's right, Roy. Clay no longer wondered why Wayland bothered to explain the plan. He was proud of it, and this was opportunity. But still, he continued, we don't gamble by dropping too many eggs in one basket. So after a few days, we move on to New Orleans. Same thing all over again. Then slowly we head west, shedding gold all the way. In only the big cities. Finally, we wind up on the coast, like L.A. We drop the rest of the loot, maybe 75 grand between us, in banks around town. Then we buy some kind of small business we can use as a dodge. For this, we have a nice commercial account, and very slowly we start pumping money into it from these nest eggs around the country. Neat, Clay. Quite. But we have one problem. First, we have to get the money out of the state of Florida. And the newspapers, to say nothing of your own personal contacts, tell us that trains, planes, ships, and all roads are being watched. But how long do they set up roadblocks? A day? 2 days? 3? 4 at the most? After that, what the hell? So we figure on 5. But we have to know. We can't guess. So I agree to go on ahead, about halfway across the state on Route 27 to Haines City. If I get through without a whisper, then I phone Marty. Tell him it's okay to drive up and bring the cash. Meet me at Haines in a certain motel. Also, this way, we're not 2 guys traveling together. Just what the boys might be looking for. Next day, I go on ahead and cross into Georgia. If it's okay, I phone Marty to follow right behind, and we meet in Atlanta. We sell 1 car and shove off again. Don't you think it would have worked, Clay? I think so, he answered. It was well thought out. You think so, and I know so. Now, Clay boy, you just tell me this. What went wrong? Who would have the best chance of crossing us up and grabbing that cash? How should I know? Said Clay sharply, reaching for some offensive position to cover his growing fear that Roy might have a clue. From your story of the check you made after the accident, it seems to me you've overlooked several possibilities. For instance? Why, for God's sake, Roy, anything could have happened. You've got people milling all over the place at the wreck. Suppose the force of the crash had snapped the trunk lock open and... Don't hand me that, Clay. You got a lot of people around. One wise guy won't risk it. He don't even know what he's after. Don't give me that. I'm not giving you a goddamn thing, Roy. You sound like the prosecuting attorney. I don't have to defend myself. You got more than your share. What you did with it is your business. If you don't want a little friendly advice, don't waste my time. Just get out. Roy smiled his bored, I'm waiting smile. So what else is new, Clay? Clay was silent. Might as well play all the cards and see if there was a trump out. If only the accident arrangement had gone as planned. There would have been no second car with a missing driver. Just Marty, careless, sleepy, drunk, but off the road without any apparent help. No questions. It never occurred to me that Marty might have the money with him, said Clay, so I haven't had much time to think about it. But right off the top of the mind, let's see. You said the car was hauled in by a wrecker? A wrecker has a crew. They couldn't have been watched every minute. Anything else, Clay? Well, sure, you can think as well as I can. The cops take the case and put it on one of the patrol cars. Routine. Later, they check it. Right away, they guess the money's stolen. 1, they keep it. Or 2, they hold it for investigation. If so, they're certainly not giving out information. Yeah, said Roy. But they would lay for some guy like me to come around. If that was the case, I'd be in the pokey right now. It was a chance I had to take. Give me another idea. As much as I hate to say this, replied Clay, did it ever occur to you that Marty could find that much money awfully tempting? He might have disposed of it before the accident. It occurred to me, said Roy. But then I got wondering why he was on the right road, headed in the right direction. See what I mean? Can you think of one more, Clay boy? Clay assumed an attitude of deep consideration. On short notice, he said finally,
It's as far as I can go with it. Roy shifted in his chair, lighted a cigarette, exhaled luxuriously. You know, he said, it kind of disappoints me that a brain like you could miss one big angle. It's a real surprise to me that an ignorant, stumble-along cluck like me could out-reason you. I'm too modest to believe it possible. Cut it, Roy, I'm already impressed. So now tell me, Clay, how could you forget about the driver of the caddy? Huh? If the bastard could swipe a car, he could swipe cash, couldn't he? And then beat it, fast. I didn't overlook that, said Clay quickly. I passed over it because it didn't make sense. Even if he had time for all that and wasn't hurt so badly he could just about crawl away, he wouldn't stop to search for money he didn't know existed. Ah, said Roy, that's the rub. But suppose he did know it existed? Clay swallowed. How? Roy got up and walked over to stand before Clay's chair. All expression had left his face. I'll tell you how. You told him, pal. You told him. What? Nonsense. That's it. You told him. You got hold of some punk for a few grand and you tipped him to follow Marty. He grabbed the case and brought it to you. Ridiculous. How could I tell him to follow Marty if I didn't know the first thing about your plan? I haven't figured that one out yet. But I don't need it, because I can tell by looking at you. I'm goddamn close. When I came over here, I was in the dark, just groping around for any kind of an answer, listening to a hunch. But when a guy like you forgets to mention some obvious angle like what gives with the missing stooge in the caddy, it must be because he's got something to hide. Where's the money, Clay? Don't try to start anything with me, Roy. You'll come out on the wrong end. You scare me. Where's that dough? Get out, Roy! For the last time, get out! Roy ignored him and began to walk around, opening a closet, studying the room. Of course, he said, knowing you, it's probably so well hidden I'll have to beat your head open to find it. But I'll just go through the motions first. He went towards one of the bedrooms, the wrong one. Waylon, I wouldn't go in there. I've got company. Clay stood and let his hand rest behind him on the butt of the .45 beneath his coat. Roy turned. Don't tell me, he said. Let me guess. Come on out, Valerie, he called. Valerie opened the door and walked into the room. Again, she was wearing the tight skirt and pink sweater. In fear and haste, she had obviously pulled the sweater over nakedness. With his eyes, Roy very carefully removed the sweater, then the skirt. He seemed to store the picture away before his gaze came up to her face. Hello, Val. How's it go? Getting your kicks? Valerie gave him a look of icy disdain, but he stared her down and she walked away, settling into the chair by which Clay was standing. What a cozy little nest, said Roy. All the luxuries. You have expensive taste, Clay. I've always wished I could afford a gal like Valerie, but I never had the money. Let's see if we can't find just what it is that holds her interest, aside from your own personal magnetism, of course. Again, he walked towards the bedroom. Don't bother, Roy. You're leaving. It was said with such calm conviction that Roy paused to look over his shoulder into the wide mouth of the gun. He came back a ways, but did not seem frightened. Expecting trouble, Clay? You don't seem like the type to carry a gun. My character changes with circumstances, said Clay. I adapt quickly. But just for your peace of mind, you wouldn't have found what you came for. We don't have it, never did. Roy scratched his nose with an index finger. Well, now, it seems to me, with a big .45 in your hand, you're a little too anxious to convince me. Goodbye, Roy. And I mean goodbye. Waylon went to the door and turned. Of course, you haven't got the guts, he said. But you'd be a lot safer if you'd just pulled the trigger right now, Clay. I never saw the inside of a jail, but I risked a long stretch to get that money. I gambled my whole life on it. Marty Bates died for his share, which I now consider to be mine. And as far as I'm concerned, without that $375,000, I'm just as good as dead. I'll be a dead man walking around looking for his lifeblood, 24 hours a day, awake or asleep. I'll be scheming ways to beat you, Clay, if I have to kill you to do it. Wherever you go, whatever you do, just keep thinking about that. Enjoy yourself, buddy boy. S'long. They looked at each other. He went out the door. My God, he means it, said Valerie in a husky voice.
He means every word, Clay. I'm scared. What are we going to do? What can we possibly do now?
End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Murder Mistress by Robert Colby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 9. The head teller of the Second National Bank in the Commercial Exchange Building on Flagler Street was a small, thin man with a narrow face, a wiry mop of gray hair, and placid gray eyes behind steel-rimmed glasses.
"I thought you looked familiar, Mr. Daniels," he said, leaning forward from his window. "And now that you mentioned WKSR, it comes back to me right away. The wife and I used to watch you on that night patrol program. Interesting show. Yes, indeed. Well, sir, what can I do for you?"
"The station," said Scott, "is considering a new program called Classic Crimes Unsolved. It would be a series of interviews with police officials and laymen having knowledge of any of the more spectacular crimes which have gone unsolved. Aside from its news and entertainment value, we would hope to enlist the aid of the public in furnishing clues which previously might have been thought unimportant. The police would bring to light some of the lesser-known facts of the case, and this in turn might stir the public memory. There are all kinds of possibilities, and for a starter, I've been assigned to investigate the details surrounding the robbery of this bank." Actually, Scott had dreamed up the idea the night before as a gimmick to get information, only to find that it was surprisingly sound. Clint Raleigh, the program director, was dubious but could see no harm in giving sanction if Daniels was willing to expand his own time gathering material for a pilot show.
"Well," said the head teller, whose name was Wilkins, "you can count on me for full cooperation. Anything that would help you bring those men to—"
"Thank you," said Scott. "Now, what time did the robbery occur?"
"It was just about 10 minutes before 10 on a Thursday morning, the 29th. We opened, as usual, at 9:30.
Scott smiled. "You wouldn't forget that, would you?" Wilkins gave his head a vigorous shake.
"Never. We had to meet several payrolls on the following day. Firms in this building and others in the neighborhood that issue their paychecks on the 15th and 30th of the month. An accumulation of 2 weeks' pay per employee can add up to a lot of money. The cash had to be counted on Thursday and dispersed on Friday."
"Now, where did this money come from, Mr. Wilkins?"
"Oh, it depends on how far you want to go back. Originally, it came with a larger amount from the nearest Federal Reserve Bank in Jacksonville. Brinks handled the delivery to the First National."
"A branch of this bank?"
"No, sir. There are no branch banks in Florida by state law. But First National has the largest amount of cash on hand in the city, and smaller banks like this one have accounts there. When we need extra cash to meet large payrolls, we draw it from them. As in this case, the money is delivered by a local armored truck outfit."
"All right," said Scott. "Now, we know where it came from and for what purpose, but the robbery took place after the money was delivered, right?"
"That's right. Within a minute or two. I was just getting ready to transfer it to the vault until we were ready to count it."
"And what happened?"
"Well, it seemed like the guards had hardly gone out the door when I found myself looking into the barrel of a revolver. There were 2 men, both wearing white coveralls, the kind painters use. They wore white gloves and those peaked painter's caps. One of them even had a paintbrush tucked in his belt."
"And masks?"
"Yeah, of a sort. Black strips of cloth which hung down from under their caps, covering their faces and leaving slits for the eyes."
"Strange get-up," said Scott. "You could tell nothing about them?"
"Nothing worthwhile. 2 men, hard-voiced, but not particularly, ungrammatical in their speech. One was taller than the other. I can't tell you another thing. You couldn't see much of their builds in those loose coveralls."
"Just what did they do and say?"
"I didn't see them approach," said Wilkins. "I was bent over the sacks. I felt the presence of someone at the window and looked up into the gun. 'It's not your money, bud,' this voice said, 'so don't take a chance on a slug through your brain. Press the little button and let my friend in through the door. And don't press any other buttons or you're dead.' All this was said in a very hushed voice. There were 2 typists at work addressing statements a few feet away, and also the deposit box girl at her desk. They heard nothing. As you see, the bank is L-shaped, and we are around the corner from the main section, out of sight. No one saw."
"So you opened the door," said Scott.
"I opened the door, and the other man, who had been standing back with his hand in his pocket, came in. He drew his gun and made the girls and myself get face down on the floor. He said, "If one of yous turns a hair in this direction, you'll get it right in the head." My God, we certainly weren't going to argue the point. We did exactly as we were told. Then what happened? We heard some quick movements, heavy breathing as they wrestled with the sacks, some whispering. Then one of the voices says, "Okay, Rick, you and Junkie load the car and take off. I'll hold the gun on these jerks another 5 minutes." After that, it was perfectly still. It wasn't much over a minute before one of the tellers came back on an errand and found us. Of course, the robbers had gone, and we turned in the alarm. It didn't seem like 2 minutes before the first police car arrived. Then the whole area was swarming with them, and in no time all the exits from the city were blocked. But there never was a single clue. No, the police now have come to believe they calmly loaded the money in a paint truck, drove somewhere, and unloaded it with their fake equipment. But not one person can be found who remembers such a truck parked outside or cruising the streets. A woman remembers seeing 2 painters carrying something down the hall of the building between them. She said it was white and looked like a big folded tarp. Of course, the money must have been in it. As you know, there are 2 entrances to the bank. This one right here in the building corridor. And at the other end, the one to the street. 2 people tried to enter here and found a sign which said, "Painters at work, use street entrance." And that, Mr. Daniels, is how they sealed off this door. Neat, said Scott. They didn't miss a trick. Absolutely professional, said Mr. Wilkins. Timing, costume, escape, all perfect. What was the exact amount stolen, Mr. Wilkins? All told, $500,1,700. Coffee and cakes for quite a while. About the names you heard. Rick and Junkie? Well, of course, there are a lot of Ricks with police records. Junkie might imply a dope addict. The police are checking, not too successfully, I'm afraid. Was there ever any mention of a woman in this case? A woman? No, sir. Not that I know of. Wilkins bore a look of studious perplexity. It seems to me, said Scott thoughtfully, that the timing was a little better than professional. Tell me this. Does the name Valerie mean anything to you? Was there ever an employee by that name in the bank? Curiosity shadowed the mild features of Mr. Wilkins. He kept the question to himself. I've been here a good many years, he said, and I'm pretty sure there never was a girl we called Valerie. Could you give me the last name? It would be one of the great pleasures of my life, said Scott, but I'm afraid I can't. If it's important, I could check. Would you? Certainly. Wilkins departed. He returned in a few minutes with a negative shake of his head. Sorry, no Valeries in our personal records. It isn't a name you hear very often. I do know of a depositor by that name, a Mrs. Valerie Hobson. How old is she? Said Scott excitedly. Wilkins considered requesting an answer of the ceiling. I'd say about 50, 55 at most. Damn, said Scott. I beg your pardon? I'm looking for someone younger. In any case, I don't think she would be a depositor. Wouldn't that be a funny one? Mr. Daniels, it would take a bit of time. Quite a bit of time without the last name. I wasn't going to ask you. It never occurred to me, but... You'd better have a seat, said Wilkins, smiling. Right over there. I'll put a girl on it and call you. Thanks, said Scott. It's all terribly far-fetched. I can't explain just now, but keep it to yourself, will you? Wilkins gave him a wink. Daniels could not sit still. He went out into the building corridors and looked around. He made a study of the exits, the streets they emptied upon, the outside entrance to the bank. The police must have covered all this ground and a lot more, with all skill and every possible aid. And yet, it was not ridiculous to suppose that he had a better chance. They had not a single clue, while he had the one big one. Valerie, the hub, with spokes of knowledge leading from her. He had been seated a good half hour when he saw Wilkins beckoning him. He went to the window. We found 2 more besides Mrs. Hobson, he said. One in checking and one in saving. If you're looking for a younger woman, you can forget the one in checking. The one in savings was a very small account which was closed out 3 weeks after it was open. The lady appears to be 26. There is an address, no phone. The name is Miss Valerie McLean. I've written it down for you. He gave Scott a slip of paper. The address was an apartment building in the southwest section. Can't thank you enough, Mr. Wilkins. This is nothing more than a rather silly hunch of mine I have to follow through. Very little hope that anything will come of it. Wilkins smiled indulgently. Glad to be of service, he said.
but Daniels did have a very big hope that Valerie McLean, age 26, would be a most attractive brunette who no longer kept her money in savings, but in a great tan suitcase. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Murder Mistress by Robert Colby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 10. The girl who opened the door to apartment 7 at the address written on the slip of paper was certainly a brunette. She could have also been 26, but here any similarity ended. The hair was close-cropped, a boyish bob crowning a tiny heart of a face containing huge and glistening dark eyes with that peculiar combination of bold, shy watchfulness associated with children. Small nose and mouth, the latter slightly spread to a smile that looked more habitual than personal. Costume of the day appeared to be lounging pajamas of pale blue. "Yes," she said. The word fell from her mouth without the slightest lip movement. "I hope I have the right address. I'm looking for Valerie." "Valerie McLean?" "That's right. Won't you come in a moment?" The living room was a walk-in closet furnished in period anonymous. A portable ironing board draped with a pink slip was fixed by the window. She indicated a chair opposite as she fell upon a daybed and drew up her legs. The same diminutive smile hovered about her face. "You know the old saying?" She opened. "Valerie doesn't live here anymore." "Oh? Then where does Valerie live?" She shrugged. "I haven't the faintest idea." Her look said it was a dull subject which should be dispatched quickly for the purpose of probing this newfound relationship. "I take it," said Scott, "that at one time she was your roommate?" "For less than 2 weeks. I imagine she found something more to her liking. Valerie's kind of a snob, you know, or don't you?" She reached for cigarettes and waited for him to make the light, cupping her hands around the flame so that her fingers rested across his wrist. He withdrew discreetly. "Yes, I suppose Valerie is something of a snob," he said. "But then, I don't know her very well. We met at a party and she gave me this address." He searched frantically for some way to match the identity. "She reminded me so much of a girl I used to know in New York, tall and dark-haired with that haughty way she carries herself, and that voice, the Park Avenue sound. You know, 'my dear.'" "That's Valerie, all right," she said, the words pushing smoke puffs ahead of them. "I don't like to be catty, but I used to think that she was a phony. See what I mean?" "Of course. She's not really my type, but I'm connected with television, and she's tall and slender enough to be perfect for a modeling bit on a show we're doing." "My name's Shirley D'Amico," she said. "I'm not tall, but terribly, terribly talented. Must you have tall girls, mister?" "Daniels, Scott, and yes, I'm afraid I must, but I'll keep you in mind for something else. And now I hate to harp on the same old subject, but I've got to find Valerie right away. Can you help?" "I wouldn't know where to begin," she said. "You could write down what I know about Valerie on your thumb. She answered an ad I put in the paper for a roommate to share expenses. She had nice clothes, and Emily Post was her best friend. She had everything. Everything but the expenses. And a job. I took her in because she promised to pay her share on the first, out of a trust fund check she said was coming to her. I tried to get her some kind of work, but nothing suited her highness. Then she just bolted into the blue." "I don't understand." "Well, I worked nights, cashier at a movie house. I came in on a Thursday around midnight, and she was gone. She didn't leave so much as a hair in the sink. Gone." "A note?" "Yes, she left a note. 'Dear Shirley, please forgive me, darling, but I had a rare opportunity that will take me out of town for a while. Hope this will soften the blow.' And get this, pinned to the note was a $50 bill. Rare opportunity indeed." "Did she ever get in touch?" "Never. I never heard from her again. The hell with roommates. I'm a loner from now on." "Did she have any friends who came here?" Shirley raised her eyebrows. "My dear man, of course. But they were always gone when I came home. Nothing but a few tattered cigarette butts, a chewed sandwich, and whiskey rings and glasses. She said nothing, and I asked no questions. Live it up and let live." "So you can't tell me one little thing by which I could trace her?" "Not one. But don't take it so hard. Little old Shirley stands ready to comfort. Valerie would have been expensive, and I'm the homey type." He looked around. "I'm sure. But come now, Shirley. You must have some clue to her, however vague. Didn't she mention the name of a single friend? I have a special reason." "She owes you money?" He looked down. "That's tough. In which case, I'll try to think." Small fingers touched brow.
she said. "A tiny name dawns, but it wouldn't do you a bit of good." "Please." "Well, I had a broken watch. Dropped it on the bathroom floor. Valerie said she had a friend who was in the watch repair business, and she would get it fixed for nothing. She mentioned someone by the name of Marty. No last name. She took the watch and had it back in a couple of days. That won't help, will it?"
"Hardly," he said dejectedly, already guessing that the name, when connected with watchmaking, was more than worth the trip. He stood, tried to keep impatience from crowding his face. "Well, it wasn't too important, Shirley. Chalk it up to experience. And thanks anyway."
"Would you like to celebrate the loss with a drink?"
It came out urgently casual. Lonely, he thought. So many like her. "Love to, but I'm on company time and late. Gotta run." He went to the door. She came after him on puppet strings, a doll dancing over the floor.
"You're a very pretty man, Scotty. Won't you come back soon?"
She placed hands behind head and arched toward him.
"Remember, I'm terribly, terribly talented."
He opened the door. "Yes," he said, "but I'm terribly, terribly married. Goodbye, Shirley." He slipped out and went down the hall with a fixed image of Shirley D'Amico's face, the dark, wounded eyes of a fawn, mouth gaping, just as though she had been stabbed. It was 10 minutes after 1. He hadn't eaten and he wasn't hungry. He stood in the lobby of the Commerce Exchange Building, consulting the directory of offices. He had just called Myra, and she had read from the newspaper. "Was identified as Martin Bates, who died this morning from injuries sustained in a puzzling two-car accident on Route 27. Mr. Bates was a watchmaker and proprietor of one-man shop, housed in the Commerce Exchange Building, was driving north to—" But that was enough. Marty, a friend of Valerie's, in the same accident. Barnes, Bassett, Bates, Martin. Room 406. He hurried to the elevator. 406 was a small, opaque glass door, one of several in a hallway. Martin Bates Watch Shop. Watch and clock repairing, all makes. Electronic precision timing, fast service. And just below this was a hand-printed sign. Closed for summer vacation. Scott Daniels returned to the main floor, all the while thinking, not coincidence. Not at all. An impossible sequence for coincidence. Marty Bates of the accident. Marty mentioned as a friend of Valerie's. Marty of the watch shop. Where? In the same building as the Second National. Then, why not Marty involved in the robbery? Marty and friend. And after the robbery, where would Marty and friend go with the loot for quick escape? Where else? To the Martin Bates watch shop. He was bursting with excitement. And yet, Marty is dead. You have a modus, and that's all. Where is Valerie? He went back into the bank and sat down for time to think. It came to him finally. If Valerie opened an account, someone must have talked with her at the time. You fill out the card and the nice man or woman takes your money. Mr. Schofield was quite a nice man behind one of many desks in a row. He was also a vice president. Why was it that vice presidents in banks never seemed to have their own offices? Anyway, Mr. Schofield had the appropriate dignity, and he held the card in his hand. He smiled pleasantly. "Yes," he said, "I see this is my signature, and so I must have opened the account. It's one of a dozen things that I do in a busy day. But it was some time ago, and there are so many. I'm afraid I don't remember the lady. Now, if it had been a large amount—" "Well, of course," said Scott. "The amount was small, but the lady, from almost any view, largely attractive. A tall brunette with a striking figure. Would that help?" Mr. Schofield allowed himself a polite chuckle. "It should help," he said, "and the point is well taken. But on the other hand, more often than you might think, we have reasonably attractive young ladies making deposits." "I think this one is unreasonably attractive, sir." Mr. Schofield continued to smile tolerantly. "If you know her, Mr. Daniels, is it?" "That's right." "Well, if you know her, Mr. Daniels, what's the problem?" "I've lost her, temporarily, I hope. And I thought if you could remember her, then you might also remember something she told you, which would help me find her." Mr. Schofield frowned. "I'm rather confused," he said. "Our head teller, Mr. Wilkins, dug this card out of the files, and he said that you were connected with one of the television stations gathering background for a crime series. Is that so?" "Yes, sir, that's right." "And that the first program on the schedule concerns the recent robbery of this bank. Now, what does that have to do with this Valerie?" He looked down at the card.
Valerie McLean.
Nothing really, Scott lied. It's a personal matter which I thought I would straighten out while I was here. Mr. Schofield began to tap the card thoughtfully on his thumbnail.
You know, Mr. Daniels, he said, sometimes a person like yourself, nosing around on perfectly legitimate business, comes across a fact or two that might have entirely escaped the police, to say nothing of the bank officials. I do think it would be a grave mistake in judgment not to pass on to us immediately the smallest detail, however seemingly unimportant.
I agree with that, Mr. Schofield, in principle, and if I had something concrete or resolved, I would take it to the police.
It need not be anything resolved at all, just the merest hint,
said Mr. Schofield doggedly, and with a countenance that was becoming increasingly stern. Scott was silent.
I assure you, said Mr. Schofield after a moment and in a more placating tone, that anything you tell me will be held in the strictest confidence. In fact, I'll go out on a limb and say that, at least for the time being, I would be willing to keep any information entirely to myself.
Scott was tempted, but having come so far alone.
I realize, continued Mr. Schofield with a man-to-man smile, that there is a substantial reward. It might influence your decision if you knew that as an official of the bank I am not eligible. On the other hand, I would be glad to work with you and help you evaluate in secrecy for a reasonable period.
Somehow, in a very remote sense, Mr. Schofield reminded Scott of Milt Lundberg. It was an executive attitude, pseudo-friendly double-talk laced with a condescension born of years behind fat desks of authority. Scott felt himself being persuaded with an invisible club, and his response was a rising irritation. Really, Mr. Schofield, he said, I think you're making much of nothing, if I may say so. I'm just another guy earning a living, and my knowledge of crime and criminals is just about what I read in the newspapers. So, getting back to my girlfriend on the card there, Valerie McLean, have you been able to remember her? Mr. Schofield knew that he was being signed off, and after a moment in which his big jaw resisted, acceptance came to his face. He looked again at the card.
Have you checked this address? He asked.
Oh, yes. She moved. Not a trace.
You're not acquainted with any of her friends?
I met her just once at a party.
And the person who invited her, the one who gave the party?
That was a tough one, but it flashed just as he was going to fumble for a cigarette in what might have been an obvious stall. Nothing doing, he said. She wasn't known, except by the man who brought her, and he was a stranger to me.
Well, said Mr. Schofield dubiously, it looks pretty hopeless. I can't seem to bring her up out of my mental file. I must talk to 20 or more people a day. Tell you what, he slid paper and pencil across the desk, just write your name, address, and phone number here for me. Then I'll give it some thought. If and when I can remember, I'll give you a call. However, it's very unlikely that she would have told me anything you could use to trace her. We don't ask for personal details, and they're seldom volunteered.
Scott wrote the information, and they stood together, shaking hands. Much obliged, Mr. Schofield.
Not at all. And Daniels, remember my advice. Don't take it too lightly. Any time you...
Sure, I'll do that. The minute I have anything that would interest you. Bye, sir. Scott Daniels moved briskly toward the exit into the building. There was within him a need for tremendous haste, yet in the corridor he paused. Hurry, he thought. But to where? End of chapter 10.